Thank you for tuning in to the second episode of our revolutionary series, Founding Philosophies. If you checked out our first program, which was on Light Horse Harry Lee, you'd see we tried to understand why founding fathers 250 years ago made meaningful contributions and sort of lived by moral precepts that are still applicable today. So I want to jump right into our second episode, which will be discussing the iconic phrase, all men are created equal. Joining me today to discuss that is David Gowdy. He runs the George Washington Center for Constitutional Studies over in Buena Vista. If you haven't been to Buena Vista in a while, you should stop by the next time you're visiting campus. But David, do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what exactly this George Washington Center does?
Sure. Thank you, Kamron. So the George Washington Center for Constitutional Studies was formed in connection with our move from Texas to Virginia. We've been in Buena Vista going on about 7 years, and it's affiliated with another organization that I've had since 2004, and that was named the Washington, Jefferson, and Madison Institute.
All founding fathers, I believe.
Yes, from Virginia. And that, I'll call it WJMI for short, which is also our blog, but it's was designed for continuing education courses for teachers in Virginia.
Okay.
So from 2004 to 2023, we held at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, continuing education courses for Virginia teachers that teach history, government, and social studies. We got some teachers also as far away as Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and other places. I worked and met through that organization some other authors and professors, and that now it's become the Virginia Institute for American History. But when I moved to Buena Vista, I wanted to do some civic education just for citizens and students and whoever wanted to come. So for about 5 years, I've taught a weekly class during the school year for free on Tuesday evenings on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the writings of the Founding Fathers.
How do the students of your class, how do they sort of take away from the program that you offer?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we have a range of ages, some students from the university there in Buena Vista, and also a former mayor and others. Some of them have a decent background on the Constitution and the history of I'll call it the American founding. Others, not as much, but the reaction's been very positive. It's never been a real big class. I think we've had as many as maybe 15 come, a pretty consistent dozen that came when I was teaching that, and they really liked it. So we took on different topics like, how did Thomas Jefferson and James Madison say the Constitution should be taught at the University of Virginia, which Jefferson founded and Madison was on the board. So here you have the father of the Constitution telling Jefferson how he thinks the Constitution should be taught. So that was kind of our basic outline. But we also address subjects like religion and the founding, the ideological origins of the American Revolution, and again, writings from each of the main founders.
Speaking of Jefferson's words, let's jump right into our subject. So this episode is on the phrase, all men are created equal. Just overview, what does that mean? What is the sort of implications of that phrase?
Yeah, so as I'm sure most people are familiar, the famous lines, I might say, of the Declaration are that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the other phrase that stands out, I think, is that all men are created equal. And what a great question to ask ourselves in this time in our generation. What did Jefferson and the founders and the signers of the Declaration mean when they said all men are created equal? And unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstanding about who they meant.
Sure.
Did they mean all men? Did they mean just white men? Did it include blacks? Did it include slaves, right? Were they created equal? And what did they mean in that equality? What was equal in its meaning? And so I think it's critical as Americans that we understand that phrase. And as I've studied it myself and written a little bit about it, the importance of that phrase has become, to me, more important than ever for us to to understand and consider.
Can you give us a little historical context? Let's assume our listener has never heard the phrase "all men are created equal." Who created the phrase in the writing that it's in? Like, what can you tell us about its actual history and when it was produced?
I would say that probably the most important way to understand what did Jefferson mean and the signers at the time, you would look to John Locke. John Locke's second treatise on government, also known as The True Original Extent and End of Civil Government, an essay written by John Locke.
This first title is a little quicker. I'd go with
Yeah,
that
I
one,
like
yeah.
the second treatise. But Locke writes about this very subject. And of course, Jefferson, when he wrote to Henry Lee about the sources that he used for the Declaration, he said, among Cicero and Aristotle was John Locke and Algernon Sidney in their writings. And so the founders and I would say the general educated public knew who John Locke was and had at least heard of, maybe they hadn't read it, but about Locke's writings. But John Locke talked about equality and in his writings in the second treatise, and he said, obviously, and I'm summarizing what his words were, but there's many ways that we're not equal, right? We're born into different situations in this world, and some are rich and some are poor, and some are of color and some are not, and some have certain intellectual or physical gifts and others don't, and we're also born in different genders, etc. So what does it mean that men are equal? Well, the first thing that's important is that, and Hamilton was great at asserting this as well, that the founders' understanding, Jefferson, Hamilton, others, was that all men included women. So whenever I'm talking about men and they talk about men, they'd also include women.
Okay.
And that needs to be made clear.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people wouldn't think that.
They wouldn't think that. But at the beginning of my booklet, I have a quote from Hamilton in that regard. So that being said, we're talking about basically all humanity are created equal. But in what ways are they equal? Because there's so many ways that we're unequal. And what Locke said was that apart from all these differences, the one thing in which we're all the same in the eyes of God, created equal, assumes a creator, is that we're equal in our rights. So given the Declaration's statement, the laws of nature and of nature's God, we realize this is what we call a natural rights document. The founders believed in natural rights, that God gave us these natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, among others, sovereignty, the consent of the governed, but that these natural rights we have is what makes us equal. So whether you're actually born into slavery or you're born free, or whether you're born in Africa or the United States or China or wherever, you're born equal in your rights before God. And that's what that key meaning is of that phrase.
I feel like a lot of people would say the Declaration is the aspiration. It's sort of the highest ideal that's attainable. It's very pretty radical in its claims, right? I mean, it sort of is a document that then will guide the French Revolution, that Lafayette is instrumental in writing sort of their outline at the beginning of the Revolution. Certainly later revolutions are also inspired by it. And then you have the Constitution, which is obviously years later. It doesn't come out the same day. It's after this revolution has been won against Great Britain. And so to a lot of people, the Constitution is, as it's formed in 1787, is sort of an imperfect piece fulfilling the Declaration's promise, and that the Constitution is the set of laws that guide the sort of moral views that the Declaration professes, and that over time the Constitution will be perfected and it'll improve and changes will be made to sort of attain what the Declaration says. But that's a sentiment I've heard several people express. I read a book in college that made that argument. How do you feel about that?
I think that's a wonderful way to think about it, as aspirational, leading to the Constitution, and that the fact the Constitution is not necessarily perfect. It's subject to amendment, and there were certain aspects of the Constitution that some argued were pro-slavery and some argued were anti-slavery. And so, but the aspirational aspects of the Declaration are true. I think it sets a high standard for all of us and for humanity, but particularly for a republic in which we're to govern ourselves. If we believe the principles of the Declaration, that there is a creator, that rights come from our creator, and that men are created equal, and that we're also sovereign, and we have the right and responsibility to choose our governors, to the consent of the governed. Those principles obviously are behind the Constitution. They're not repeated in the Constitution, but I call them kind of like the blueprint. So we're in this lovely home now that's been renovated, and the blueprints were probably important to the renovation and understanding different aspects of the building.
Sure.
But so in the Constitution, you kind of have this structure that we see, but the Declaration, I would say, is kind of like the blueprints, what the design and purposes of the Constitution were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great sort of analogy to use, that it's the blueprint of the Declaration guiding the future constructions that come. And maybe that's a good reminder that Americans today should look back on the blueprint whenever we need to fix something, and not, try to create something from fresh. We have a good model, and I think reading the Declaration today, the sentiments in it, maybe skipping over the parts about the barbaric piracy and all the sort of other lines that were more applicable to that specific generation. But the general sentiments expressed, the lines that get quoted, that they make T-shirts of, those really are foundational even today. But I want to actually sort of question the Declaration a little bit. We have on our wall here in Fancy Hill, and you can't see it on this video, but for people that have been here before, we have the first draft of the Declaration, a facsimile, framed up in the wall just sort of right behind you. This is the first version that Jefferson pins, right? It's sort of his, obviously, how drafts work. He strikes certain things out. And what's the major difference that you think is relevant to this particular phrase, all men are created equal? I assume that's in the first draft, and that it obviously stays into the one that we know, but what can
that phrase, yes, exactly. That phrase does remain. I'd say the most disappointing or dramatic change was that Jefferson had language condemning slavery and arguing against the King of England's, basically, supporting that from Great Britain as the primary empire supporting the slave trade. And when that gets to the Committee of Five, which includes John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, it gets struck down. And primarily in knowing that South Carolina and other southern colonies or states at that time were not going to support that, it gets struck out. And Jefferson bemoans that fact, that was particularly taken out. And also in the language he used in the draft, he did refer to slaves as men and not property. So that's really key, I think, as far as something that changed.
I know it will become a big debate, especially during the Dred Scott decision in the 1850s, as to what the phrase all men are created equal meant, and there is a lot of referencing. And I think some of the justices in their dissent from Taney actually cite the sort of implication of men meaning enslaved people as well, right? That black people were in fact considered by that point, 70 years ago, to be men, and therefore these tenets should apply. You mentioned some southern states would have objected to it, and that's why Jefferson amended the draft. Southern
the Committee
colonies.
of Five.
Yeah. So the Committee of Five strikes out this language, and you have South Carolina and Georgia. I feel like a lot of later on in the convention for the Constitution, it's a lot of striking things out, changing things because of South Carolina and Georgia. And I want to sort of re-describe how a great professor at W&L explained this to me, that, in an ideal world, they leave in all that language, right? In an ideal world, we accept that slavery in 1776 and again in 1787 is a problem, that it's unequivocally ends with the concept of liberty and this American experiment. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a practical world, and the lawmakers, these founding fathers that are writing their letter of independence and then writing the form of government that will continue to guide our country, they have to recognize practical challenges. And I think there's a lot of those you see in the Constitution, something like the slave trade, which, the founding fathers say for 20 years, nothing can be done to it, right? They give a specific date. That's a matter of practicality. We have to get this document through. We have to get it to pass. And it's kind of, you could criticize it as kicking the can down the road, but I think it's more so a matter of thinking what is the most effective way to end slavery long term. The Declaration and the Constitution, they're documents of practicality to some extent. You can't have the most ideal extreme of what we want. That's what the philosophers can do, right? That's what John Locke can write or whoever, because they're not implementing policy changes. So in the Constitution, there is this 20-year slave ban reference that the importation through the transatlantic slave trade will not be affected for 20 years. And I know that gets criticized a lot today by sort of progressive critics of the founding fathers as well. They were fine with the importation of slavery. And I think also Great Britain will end the slave trade a year before America does. And I was in a class with a professor at WNL once, different professor, who was criticizing America for waiting till Great Britain ended it. And I thought, well, they legally couldn't do anything until the next year, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure the day they were legally allowed to end the importation of slaves from Africa, Jefferson abolished it.
Congress did.
Yeah.
They were allowed then after 20 years to pass the law ending the slave trade and the importation. And Jefferson at the time was president, which is really interesting.
It is.
Kind of a wonderful irony in a way, because he had penned the Declaration, and here he is signing into law the end of the slave trade. Now, obviously, as we know, it didn't end slavery, but it was very significant. And it's interesting that Jefferson's language in the Declaration inspired those in England to help make their great effort, and the movie Amazing Grace sets that forth so wonderfully with those that were involved in England. But yes, that's how it came to pass here. So it was a great blow to slavery in that sense, that slave trade is over. But again, the greater issue that led ultimately to the Civil War was that there's still slavery.
Right. And again, I think looking at it as this matter of practicality, you can only fix so many issues at one time. If, in the ideal world, if Thomas Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration is fully accepted as is by the committee, and they don't strike out certain language, if the Constitution in 1787 does not, if it expressly prohibits slavery, if it says slavery is unconstitutional, does the Constitution get passed? Absolutely not. South Carolina never ratifies it. And so the compromises that constitute the Constitution, and there are a great deal of compromises, are really, I think, reflective of how serious that generation was in making the best they could in that moment, and really trying to recognize, and you could make an argument on one way or the other. Is the Constitution pro-slavery? Is it anti-slavery? I myself, from what I have studied, and I took a class on slavery in the Constitution at WNL, so I have some knowledge. I would say it's an anti-slavery document in that it never once uses the word slavery. It never enshrines the actual textual language. And I think the Declaration is much the same. It doesn't sort of, even striking out the section on men being held in bondage, or however it phrases it, it's certainly not a pro-slavery document by any means. And again, disagree with me if I'm out of line.
No,
here.
I'm in 100% agreement. And as I talk a little bit about in my essay, and we'll get to this maybe a little bit, Frederick Douglass, began with his opinion that the Constitution was somewhat pro-slavery, but after he studied the writings of the founders to some degree and met with some others that weren't Lloyd Garrison, I can't remember who it was that he kind of switched to, but he changed his opinion. And he said, no, he believes it's an anti-slavery document. And then he wrote and spoke about that the rest of his life. And he looked at the elements of it and said it came out as a natural rights document that does actually in the slave trade, and again, like you say, didn't talk about slavery, and that the founders, were inspired, and that we should honor them.
Hmm. Yeah, and I do want to talk more about Douglass and Lincoln some, and sort of their interpretations of the founding generation, what they meant. And I'm glad you brought up William Lloyd Garrison. He's another one who I often bring up because his interpretation was very different. And so we'll get to
Yeah, he
that.
wanted to burn the Constitution.
Yeah, well, he did at one point, literally.
Well, I guess literally did.
Yeah.
So
But let's jump back to Jefferson.
sure.
So Jefferson's from Virginia, right? He's in this great Virginia wave of founding fathers that just had such a profound impact. I can't blame you for moving to Virginia to run this, right? Because it's the place to be to talk about that generation. And we've got Jefferson on this table here next to us, writing some document. We'll call it the Declaration. So Jefferson's a Southerner, right? I mean, I think Virginia is considered a Southern state, and he also owns slaves. So how is he different from the South Carolinians? I mean, it seems like Jefferson seems to be opposed to this institution, whereas others in his time, and I guess you could say the Deep South or the Deeper South, might not have held such liberty views.
So Jefferson is somewhat unique compared to maybe some other slave owners in the South. He's a son, we might say, of the Enlightenment. And here he has not only read Locke and Sidney, but his library becomes the basis for the Library of Congress. So he is extremely well educated and well read, just like Madison, as in comparison, also from Virginia, and both against slavery. But Jefferson, I would say, I don't know, like from an early age that I can speak of that, but as soon as he's elected to the House of Burgesses, he brings forth a bill to want to, end slavery in Virginia. And of course it's shot down. But if you look at the efforts of Jefferson, and some people say, well, he didn't do enough, right, in his life. But among the founders, he probably made more anti-slavery efforts than any other founder.
Wow.
All the way to the Northwest Ordinance and other things that, ended slavery in the Northwest Territories, signing the congressional bill to end the slave trade, but also other personal efforts. But at being a Virginian and being from the South, at every corner he faced great opposition, right, to some of these efforts. But you do have Franklin writing a letter to Congress late in his life wanting to end slavery. Congress, doesn't act on that. But Jefferson himself called it a hideous blot. And even though he was a slave owner, it's kind of hard for us to maybe realize, and what would you do? But you're born into this. You're born into a slave owning family, and you inherit slaves not only from your parents but from your wife. And what do you do? And his experience with slavery was how do I want to say, difficult, I think, for him to reconcile as he came to be an enlightened person believing in natural rights, and how do you deal with that? So I think he's unique in one sense.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of founding fathers that struggle with this concept. And you mentioned, he's born into it. It's sort of inherited. I think that's generally the consensus that so many of the, sort of aristocratic founding fathers understand is, we didn't create this system of slavery. It was here, right? I mean, it's been in America for well over a century. You date it to 1619, and it's deeply embedded in American culture and culture of most of the world at this time, right? Where the British Empire is, there is slavery, and Britain will ban it in England before they ban it in their colonies and other holdings, right? So it's an incredibly nuanced, complicated institution. But I think, again, you recognize it's a challenge, and how to end slavery. You can't just snap your fingers and end the institution. I think Robert E. Lee later on will have much the same sort of moral quandaries when he inherits from his wife's father um, the Custis plantation slaves, and Lee is made executor of that to emancipate them within 5 years. And by the 1850s, the sort of legal bureaucracy, you could say, the red tape surrounding manumission and slavery is much thicker and messy than it is in 1776 when Jefferson is writing that. But even then, in 1776, it's not as simple as you just sign a paper, right? I mean, there are pretty complicated laws, as you know, laws obviously become very complicated in any case. But for something like slavery, which is so rooted in, I think morally reprehensible concepts, having to sort of justify that. And then there's questions of where did these people go? They don't have family that they can depend on. They're within, if they're an enslaved person and you're freed, where do you go? You don't have job opportunities. You're competing with other people who are enslaved, right? So typically there's laws that require you leave the state. So Virginia, I know, has, what is it, 6 months or so you have to leave after being freed to go to another state, or you could be re-enslaved.
It's actually a year.
Is it a year? Yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, that it's a very difficult situation, and that's not to justify it or to say, oh, it should last longer or whatever, but it's just to recognize that it's more complicated than you typically see. And I can sympathize with Jefferson in recognizing the plight there. And I think in your essay, which is sort of what inspired this program, you mentioned Jefferson's estate at the end of his life. He is deeply indebted, as a lot of founding fathers are. Our last episode on Light Horse Lee talked about this. And enslaved people are assets, they're financial assets, and they're sort of burden to someone's estate and debts. And, that complicates someone's financial wherewithal. So, you have George Washington, who is sort of the center of this room, and, the namesake of my university. He in his will emancipates all of his slaves. Once upon the passing of his wife, says they're to be emancipated. Washington's debt was nowhere near that of Jefferson. And
no, he was in the black, not in the red, like Jefferson.
Yeah, and so how does that sort of factor in to Jefferson's view? And I guess another question: do you think that Jefferson's perspective in life changes from 1776 when he's younger, he's more optimistic, there's this revolutionary fervor, towards the end of his life, 50 years exactly after the signing of the Declaration? Do you think he sort of has stepped away from this belief that all men are created equal, that slavery is a sort of a blot on America?
So that's a great question at the end, and let me get to that. Mm-hmm. But first I want to address a couple things you brought up. There were laws against manumission in Virginia. It made it difficult to free slaves. Mm-hmm. Jefferson did free his cook that had been trained in France to cook for him. Mm-hmm. And he went, I believe it was on to Maryland, and he got a job. Unfortunately, began drinking a lot of alcohol, became an alcoholic, and committed suicide. It tore Jefferson's heart, mm-hmm. to lose his cook. Now, when I say he's a friend, I don't know if you can say that he was a friend, but he was in one sense dear to Jefferson, having been mm-hmm. with him in France, trained him, and now here he is freed and committing suicide in mm-hmm. the circumstances he's in. Now, there's different ways to look at that, but I want to say that some of the things that Jefferson did do to try to keep families together, he was known as a benevolent slaveholder, for what that may count. Coming back to his estate, yes. So under the laws of Virginia and other southern states, we're talking that slaves are treated as property, and that's known as chattel. And so if you're in debt on your plantation, the lenders that you are a debtor to have a lien on your slaves. Mm-hmm. And so that complicates things. So setting all that aside, your last question was, did Jefferson's opinion change? Well, I think if anything, I believe it didn't change. And if anything, I think it grew stronger over the course of being tested, that he always believed that all men were created equal. Mm-hmm. And his writings evidence that. And in a letter that I mentioned in my essay, he talks about the fact that while they're not equal in society, and while we can judge at that time slaves in one way that we wouldn't do today, at the same time he still believed in their natural rights, and he stood for that his whole life.
It's a really tough position to be in, to someone like Jefferson, who made such lasting critical contributions to the Western world, to democracy, to liberty, but to also be a human who has personal interest, has, you know, worldviews that are going to be criticized in his own time and criticized after, right? And he's such a famous person. The spotlight is on him, right? It's on him during his entire life. I remember he, wants to sort of like Washington become this sort of, remove himself from politics after the presidency. But, he's still very important, right? People still want to hear what Jefferson has to say. And 200 years after his death, they still want to hear what he has to say, right? I mean, it's sort of, he can never escape the attention. And that's just how the founding generation is. They're so critical in changing the world that they're always going to be open to more scrutiny and more criticism. And, I think the criticism's fair. I think it's good to have that. I think it just needs to be rooted in historical education, right? And civic education, and understanding, not just let's generally cast stones at everybody who owned slaves or everybody who, didn't believe in women's suffrage, right? I mean, there's things you can poke at, but you can do it in a way that I think is fair and balanced. And I think that is how the next generation looks back on the founders. So, or we say maybe the next generation, a generation and a half later, you have people like Abraham Lincoln, people like Frederick Douglass, who look back to the founders as their example of justifying their views of why slavery is wrong. You have really, I would say, that generation, they're all looking back to the founders. They're interpreting it in different ways. So a great example of that is the Dred Scott case. I wrote a pretty lengthy research paper in my Slavery in the Constitution class, so I read more into it than most probably would ever want to. But, it's so interesting in that case how the different perspectives people give, and giving legal justifications for this case surrounding a, enslaved man, Dred Scott, who is, sues for his freedom, and it's a super complicated tell, but ultimately it ends with a majority opinion given, which most historians today would say is, was had a lot of factual errors in the majority by Roger Taney, but Taney interprets his majority opinion, which basically rules that black people, regardless of the actual case, black people were never citizens and therefore aren't able to appeal any case. They have no sort of legal right to do so. And again, that's been heavily criticized that, of course, no longer is the law of the land because slavery is abolished and other laws. But the basis that Taney has for a lot of it is looking at what the founders say. And Taney says, and again, this gets criticized, Lincoln calls this out in a speech right after the decision. Taney says that no black person, or I don't know if he says person, but they had never become a citizen anywhere. And of course, that's not true. There's lots of northern states in which there were citizens of, black Americans who were either formerly enslaved or descendants of slaves. So there's a lot of those factual errors. But Taney's looking back to that founding generation. On the same side, William Lloyd Garrison, who's a radical abolitionist, right? You mentioned him earlier, burns the Constitution in sort of a public speech. He believes that the Constitution is enshrouded in pro-slavery sentiments, that it was the founding generation did mean to observe this, and he rejects that sentiment, right? He basically says, these people were wrong, and we need to change it now. And Garrison is really embraced by a lot of modern progressives as a staunch abolitionist defending liberty, and certainly his views against slavery were right? Like, slavery was bad. We can agree on that. But I think he was overly critical of the founders and misread their intentions, misread Jefferson. And so I want to talk and have you talk about the other side of the issue. Lincoln and Douglas as two that sort of stand out in civics education as two people in different ways and from certainly different backgrounds look at the founders and sort of credit them with this notion that all men are created equal, right? That they actually did mean it in the way that helps us in the 1850s end the institution of slavery. So could you talk a little more about those two and how they sort of were inspired by all men are created equal?
Yes. So first, let me talk about Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
So Abraham Lincoln is born in 1809.
In Kentucky, my home state.
There you go.
Yeah.
And he remembers as a teenager the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the day that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson die on the 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
And he recalls that at Vicksburg later in his life as president. You have Abraham Lincoln, who's self-taught, and he studies the writings of the founders on his own. And at one point in his political career, I believe maybe it was when he was president, I can't remember the time that he said this, but he said he never had a feeling politically that didn't spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
And he admired Jefferson tremendously. And there's actually a piece, and I cited in my essay, that was done by the White House Studies and was published, that talks about Abraham Lincoln's Thomas Jefferson and how often Abraham Lincoln wrote or spoke about Jefferson and the Declaration, etc. But anyway, so you have probably the key time to analyze Lincoln is when he's having the debates with Stephen Douglas. So in the 1850s, they're both running in Illinois for the office of Senator of Illinois. Stephen Douglas, who's a proponent of popular sovereignty, that, oh yeah, in the territories, we're going to let people vote to actually adopt slavery, and is arguing for that. And Lincoln, of course, is saying that's not right, that's not moral. You can't vote your territory into slavery. But in these debates, Lincoln, who had actually served one term in Congress and had studied and read about these things in the Library of Congress, was able to state unequivocally that no founder, no signer of the Declaration, no signer of the Constitution, and no members of the First Continental Congress or the Constitutional Congress ever said that blacks were not included in all men are created equal.
Wow.
I mean, what a tremendous statement. He said, I challenged Douglas or anyone to prove me wrong. Well, no one ever did.
Yeah.
Not until you have the change in sentiment in the South, when actually the founding generation, I would say if you'd interviewed delegation from South Carolina or Georgia, they would have said, yeah, we're going to end slavery. We just don't want to have it end right now in the Constitution. But what happens into the 1830s is you have the tremendous growth of cotton. And at the time, and it's been called since, King Cotton becomes this huge source of revenues for slaves, for slave plantations, harvesting cotton and selling it not only just in the United States, but to Europe, etc. So you have this huge, now ingrained financial interest, hard to overcome. Well, yeah, we're going to let our slaves go and let all of our millions of dollars go that come from cotton.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are great challenges. But so Lincoln, I think, stands right there as, the founders meant what they said. And then, of course, when he's elected president, the South basically says he's wrong. And you have Alexander Stephens in the Cornerstone Speech saying, the founders got it wrong. All men aren't created equal, right? And I'm not saying every Southerner stood for that. And you've mentioned Lee, which he probably wouldn't have. But the point is you have this sentiment, and of course they adopt the Constitution word for word, except add a slave clause, right? In the South,
well,
in the Confederacy.
And I'm amazed by Alexander Stephens' speech, the Cornerstone Speech. Now, most people don't know that speech, which is really condemning, and it's used today frequently to criticize the cause of the Confederacy, which would be a great episode topic for another program. But that speech actually got Stephens sort of censored by Jeff Davis. He never gives another speech during the Civil War at all as vice president of the Confederacy.
Yeah, he said he went too far. This wasn't.
Yeah, and so it's sort of an interesting piece. What, aside from that, the slavery bit that's more often mentioned, this claim that the founders got it wrong is almost anathema to the Confederate cause. The Confederacy sees themselves as the second revolution. Right? We're following in the footsteps of George Washington, of the founding fathers, standing up against tyrants. There's also a change in the South, and you mentioned, the founding fathers. Lincoln mentioned this, and you did as well. None of them. They all sort of thought slavery would end at some point, whether 100 years, right? I think Lincoln sort of had this sort of 100-year expectation that gradually, earlier in his life, that it would just fade away over time. And there's a shift, notably in the sort of mid antebellum period, where there's now people saying that slavery is a moral good, and you have John Calhoun who makes this argument very famously.
What I was going to refer to.
Yeah, actually, the president of Washington College prior to the Civil War, he's very fascinating. George Junkin, he's a pro-slavery unionist. So he leaves this college because the students are raising up a secessionist flag early on, prior to Fort Sumter and all of this, raising up this flag, and he says, "Look, I'm not putting up with secessionists. Either you make them stop or I leave." And he leaves campus and famously rubs his boots on Virginia soil as he exits for the last time. But he was pro-slavery and actually believed in the biblical justification of slavery, and wrote delivered a speech prior to his time as president here. He was president at another college, gave this speech, and John Calhoun actually personally wrote him, saying that this was the greatest defense of slavery I've ever read. Great work.
I think I've read about this.
Yeah, and so it's sort of, that is a pretty new concept in sort of relative terms of up to the Civil War. Like, that's a fresher idea that actually, slavery is good. Certainly is not what the founders thought at all, even the ones in South Carolina. And so I think when people look back on this era today, people looking back and criticizing the founders, if you just polled sort of Americans generally, I'd be curious how many would actually think Thomas Jefferson and, George Washington and whoever would say, oh, slavery was good, right? And that's, the real answer is zero, but
exactly,
people would think otherwise.
I appreciate you mentioning those things, because again, that period of time, I'll just call it roughly 1830 to 1860, you have this shift. And if you think about, we're talking about moral issues here, and I think if we have a sense of morality and what's right and wrong, nobody's going to say slavery was right today.
Mm-hmm.
And we say, how did people, let's say, for example, that many of them were Christian, how did they justify in their minds and hearts owning people as property and subjecting them to the life of a slave? And so you have people that, like what you mentioned, that write and justify in biblical terms the difference in cultures and in, I guess you call it somehow a right to govern others, so to speak.
Sure.
Right? And it's really interesting. And so you have, with the growth of cotton and the money, you're going to have to try, how are you going to justify what you're doing on moral terms? They find ways to do it. And to me and others, obviously today, we're like, how in the world could you justify this as a moral good? But they do.
Yeah.
And it leads to the Civil War, because then it's so entrenched now in Southern society and in their moneyed interests that they have, that there's other causes to the Civil War, but most people agree today that the primary cause was slavery.
Yeah, let's go to Frederick Douglass. He is obviously a former slave, sort of the voice of Black Americans in the sort of antebellum and after the Civil War. Critically important American figure. And what was his view of the founding generation? I mean, how did he look at? Was he like, I said he wasn't, so hopefully I'm right. He wasn't like William Lloyd Garrison in thinking that the Constitution was a pro-slavery enshrinement of that.
So Frederick Douglass, former slave, initially does follow Garrison at the beginning of his political or career, if you want to call it political. I mean, his speaking out about these issues was of the opinion that the Constitution was pro-slavery. But again, he shifts and he moved. I'm trying where he was at the time. I know it was on the East Coast, and it may have been Philadelphia, but he moves to Rochester, New York. And in connection with his move, Frederick Douglass talks about getting his hands on some of the writings of the founders, and he starts studying himself the writings of the founders, and his opinion shifts. And again, I can't remember, it's in my essay, who he connects up with that's of the opinion that the Constitution is anti-slavery, but he embraces it fully. And then he speaks in some of the great speeches that he gave, like "What to a Slave is the 4th of July," and again, I believe it's in Glasgow, Scotland. Is the Constitution pro-slavery or anti-slavery? And so his opinion shifts, and he becomes an outspoken critic of those that want to burn the Constitution or abandon it, and like Garrison, and not even participate in voting, for example.
Right.
So Frederick Douglass, in the one, I believe it's the one that he gave in Glasgow, is talking about the founders and that they should be honored, and that they did stand up for these principles. They not only talked the talk, they did walk the walk.
He's critical where he needs to be, right? I mean, he will criticize anybody for them following slavery and being hypocrites with the sort of democratic process that people embrace. But I'm reminded of his speech that he gives at the dedication of the Freedmen's Memorial in D.C., I think maybe in the 1870s. And, this statue has become kind of controversial in recent years because it depicts slaves being sort of emancipated, but in a very sort of paternal type way. And it's today there's more critics of it. But Douglass gives a speech at the dedication, and he says something along the lines of, Abraham Lincoln did more for the black race than anybody in history, something like that. I mean, it's a glowing endorsement of Abraham Lincoln. And I think that sentiment reflects exactly what we should be reflecting today, this view that, and he in the speech, he calls out Lincoln for certain things. He says, could he have done more? Yes. Was
he's
was
somewhat
he faulted?
critical of Lincoln at times, right?
And he's very critical during the Civil War when Lincoln doesn't, before the Emancipation Proclamation, he's really critical. This needs to be a top issue. So he calls out Lincoln where necessary, but he admires Lincoln, and he gives Lincoln credit for doing what was necessary to ensure this phrase, all men are created equal. And of course, Douglass dies at a time when black people in America don't have the same rights that white people have, that women don't have the same rights, right? And so there is work still to be done, and Douglass is very aware of that. But he is then picked up, these sentiments are continued, much like how his generation continued them from the founders. A later generation during suffrage and civil rights are going to continue them. And then today, I guess sort of, I want you to answer this for me if you can, what our role is today in understanding all men are created equal and understanding the sort of aspirational moral objectives of that founding generation, and how can understanding that generation help us today to continue to make the best of this, American experiment?
I appreciate that. And what a great question. So, as we've been discussing, as you've kind of mentioned, as you're wrapping up some observations about Douglass, is that one thing I think it's critical for us to understand as we look back at the founding generation, at the Declaration, about what they meant, is the difference between natural rights and civil rights, right? So civil rights are granted by government. We have the Civil Rights Act, and we have various things that have come to pass to try to make men more equal in society. In Lincoln's generation, even in Illinois in the North, I mean, they weren't ready to embrace blacks and interracial marriage and various things that would be on people's minds, right? We're talking about the integration of society, no matter your color. And so you have this 200 plus year progress up until, the 20th century, helping that to come to pass on a civil rights basis. But the important thing that I feel like we need to understand and embrace is that if we embrace, as you say, the aspirational standard of all men are created equal in natural rights, and that we owe these rights to God, to our Creator, and that's the foundation, and it's a standard that we aspire to. And if that's our aspirational goal, with the Declaration, holding it up now on the 250th anniversary, then we analyze civil rights and what we have accomplished, which is tremendous, I believe, but what still is yet to be accomplished in our society. And obviously there's still prejudice in society. There are those that are unfortunately still racist. I might say on both sides of color, so to speak, right? Unfortunately, but that's the aspirational goal that we might say as we have as children of God to try to be more perfect. But as I conclude my essay, the founders, to a man, believed in virtue, and that virtue is the foundation of the republic, and that virtue leads to happiness. And this is a virtuous principle that we're talking about, that we look at one another and don't judge one another based on the color of our skin. As Martin Luther King says, we should judge each other based on our character.
Yeah.
And so I think what a great message for the 250th anniversary, that we look at these things, consider them, hopefully do some reading and try to understand more. We're not going to all agree on everything as we analyze the past and the founders, but I think there's some fundamental truths that hopefully to us are still self-evident.
That's very eloquently put. I think I couldn't have said it better. The awareness of natural rights and that they're God-given. I'm hoping to do an episode coming up about the Founding Fathers' religious views and sort of push back against the notion that they wanted a society full of atheists. I think that's sort of contrary to what they would have thought. But a higher purpose, a higher role in life, and that that's what I love so much about America, is it is a nation-building, future-looking world. I mean, a country that is driven towards making it better, not just for us, but for our posterity, for the next generation. And you don't have that in every country in the world, right? And America changes the way that we think about society and our purpose in life. And I think the words "all men are created equal," written 250 years ago, are extremely good guidelines to guide your pursuit of virtue today. And so thank you for talking
Yeah, if
about
I could
that.
just close with a couple of thoughts. One is, and I didn't mention, I meant to, if you look at Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he says that this is the primary cause for which America was founded, is equality. And ultimately, he gave his life, in a sense, for that. But just reread the Gettysburg Address, if nothing else, and think about what he's saying there, right? But in conclusion, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me. And I thought for the audience, if they're interested in reading the essay, they can go to my blog, which is WJMI, which stands for Washington Jefferson Madison Institute, WJMI.blogspot.com, and they'll find the essay online.
Great. Yeah, we'll put it up on the screen
Okay,
so they
perfect.
can click on it. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Kamron.
Thank you so much, David, for being here. And thank you for listening to this second episode of our series. Again, Founding Philosophies. It's a really important program for you to share this 250th anniversary of America's independence. So thank you for tuning in. Have a great day, and go Generals.